Hi, everyone. Welcome to the American Wild Horse Campaign presents A Wild Night, a series of short films about America's wild horses and burros. My name is Grace Kuhn. I'm AWHC's Communications Director, and I will also be your virtual MC tonight. We presented the following event on May 12th at Patagonia in Reno, but we thought our supporters across the country would also like to attend. A little bit about us, if you don't already know. The American Wild Horse Campaign is the nation's leading wild horse conservation organization. Our mission is to secure the future of America's iconic wild horses and burros and the public lands where they roam. This is an especially important issue in Nevada, where this event was held, where more than half of the nation's federally protected wild horses live, and where polling shows 86% of Nevadans support protecting wild horses as defining symbols for the state. Our program tonight will be a series of short videos on wild horses and burros and the issues facing them, followed by an expert panel discussion. We also had attendees submit questions beforehand, which will be asked to our panelists. So let's get started. In this first short piece, we will introduce you to America's wild horses. The American wild Mustang, revered for its beauty, power, independent spirit, and will to survive in the harshest of habitats. Protected, like the bald eagle, as a symbol of freedom and living embodiment of the spirit of the West, but caught in the crossfire of a struggle for the future of America's public lands. The horse has been called North America's gift to the world. The species evolved on the continent and persisted for millions of years before going extinct only thousands of years ago. Dr. Beth Shapiro, an evolutionary molecular biologist with the University of California, Santa Cruz, leads the Original Horse Project, which aims to understand the evolutionary history of horses.
We've discovered that horses moved across the Bering Land Bridge, which connected North America and Asia, during glacial periods when the sea level across the world was quite a lot lower than it is today, which exposed a land bridge connecting these two continents. Every time there was a land bridge, horses would move across from North America into Siberia, and from Siberia back into North America. When horses went extinct 12,000 years ago, they were locally extinct, but they were not globally extinct. When Europeans brought them back to North America several hundred years ago, that was simply reintroducing a native species to the North American continent.
The wild herds that grace the land today are descendants of the horses brought back to American shores by the Spanish beginning in the early 1500s. Returned to the land where they evolved, the horses thrived. But by the 1950s, their populations had declined dramatically to less than 25,000 due to Mustangers, ranchers and cowboys who cleared the land of wild horses for their livestock by cruelly killing or capturing them for slaughter. The brutality of this practice galvanized public outrage and led to the passage of the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971. The law declared these animals to be living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. It was unanimously passed by Congress, which considered the animals to be fast disappearing and aimed to protect them from capture, branding, harassment, or death. Today, wild horses and burros live on 27 million acres spread across 10 western states, with the largest horse populations residing in Nevada. Most are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, an agency under the U.S. Department of the Interior, and live in designated habitats on public lands called herd management areas, which are located in some of the most remote and rugged lands in the country. Wild horses live in complex and dynamic social structures known as bands that average between 5 to 12 animals. A band consists of a stallion, the male, a lead mare, the dominant female, and several other mares and their offspring. When the male offspring reach their teenage years, the lead stallion will usher them out of the herd to begin the journey of finding their own families. Typically, these youngsters form what is known as bachelor bands, groups of male horses that live and spar together until they are mature enough to find their own mates. Wild horses can travel up to 20 miles a day in search of food and water. As prey animals, they do not remain in one area except for periods of rest. Unlike cattle, which congregate in riparian areas, wild horses trail in and out of water, with bands taking turns getting a drink before moving off. Studies have shown that horses spread native plant seeds as they move across the landscape, and their impacts on the land are primarily limited to trailing. Despite federal protections, the future for America's wild horses is anything but assured. Caught in a struggle for control of resources on Western public lands, they face near eradication under a government program that rounds them up by the thousands each year to make room for commercial livestock grazing. Captured wild horses and burros are loaded onto trailers and transported to tax-funded holding facilities where these once wild animals are confined to feedlot corrals, or worse, end up in the slaughter pipeline. Polls show that the vast majority of Americans want wild horses protected on our Western public lands. But the federal government, under pressure from the powerful beef industry, is on a course to destroy America's wild herds. In 1971, wild horses were fast disappearing from the American West, and it took an uprising by the American people to save them. 51 years later, wild horses are again on the precipice, and the power of the people is needed for their protection. In his signing statement of the 1971 law, President Richard Nixon was quoted as saying, "Wild horses and burros merit man's protection as a matter of ecological right, as anyone knows who has ever stood awed at the indomitable spirit and sheer energy of a Mustang running free." Catching a glimpse of wild horses experiencing freedom will take your breath away. They are deeply entwined with the history and culture of this nation, and an integral part of the Western landscapes where they roam. In a world where so much that is wild has been lost, there is still a corner of the West where wild horses run free. It's worth fighting for. Join us to conserve these national treasures. Their future is in our hands. In this next piece, we will tackle the most controversial aspect of the wild horse issue, as well as the driving force behind many wild horse roundups and removals from public lands. We'll take you out to the Red Desert, to a 2.5 million acre swath of public lands, to hear from biologist and executive director of the Western Watersheds Project, Eric Mulvar, to learn more about the inequities of public lands management.
Well, I've been coming out to the Red Desert for about 20 years. And this is about the worst I've ever seen out here in terms of things being pounded by livestock. This area is a checkerboard between federal land and private land, and it's all unfenced, it's all open range, and the cattle pretty much wander where they will. This looks like they've trucked in a bunch of hay to feed the cattle because there's just not enough for them to eat out here. It's pretty unusual to see cattle in the middle of winter in the Red Desert, but there are some places where they basically have it open to year-round livestock grazing. Most of the West is very arid. The vegetation's very fragile, the soils are very thin, the rainfall is very sparse, and cattle are ill-suited to arid Western landscapes. These are animals that evolved in the boggy northern European forests of places like Poland and Germany. They're best suited to areas with high rainfall, lots of vegetation productivity, and they do very poorly in arid environments. So when you put them in arid environments and try and force that square peg into the round hole, then what you get is the cattle concentrating along streams, in river bottoms, in those areas that are the natural biodiversity hotspots of the desert. And the cattle get into those areas and concentrate their use there and mow down the vegetation and destroy the shrubs and completely disrupt the ecosystem because they're misfits. Ecologically, they're misfits. Cattle, they won't venture more than 2 miles from water, and anytime you provide water out in the middle of the desert like this, they concentrate around that water. And they create what's called a Piosphere. That's an area of denuded vegetation that surrounds the water feature. The interesting thing is that wild horses will forage 20 miles or more from water. And so they can take advantage of areas that haven't been grazed by cattle. And they also use different habitat types at different times of the year than cattle are using. That's where you find the healthy bunch grasses and the biological soil crusts in the areas where the vegetation isn't so beaten down. So they're avoiding competition by spatially segregating themselves in space and time. Certainly, the Bureau of Land Management has got a serious problem with the way it evaluates the impacts of cattle and sheep on public lands. It is basically authorizing overgrazing on purpose. Typically on a grazing allotment, they're going to authorize 50 or 60% of the annual vegetation production to be removed by cattle and sheep. That leaves the other 50% for wildlife, like elk and mule deer, for wild horses, for grasshoppers, for mice, for insects, and then the grass plant has to survive to make it to the next year. No wonder we have such serious overgrazing problems when the BLM is authorizing overgrazing as a standard operating procedure. If you look at public lands ranching, taxpayers are shouldering an enormous burden to have the privilege of having private ranchers graze their cattle on public lands. The cost of a cow-calf pair for a month is $1.35 for a month to feed a cow and a calf on public lands. Contrast that to what it might take to feed a hamster. It would be more expensive to feed a hamster than the BLM charges for public lands ranchers to come out on public lands with their cattle. And if you look at private lands, and the federal government has done this in their own investigations, they found that on average, in western states where the public lands ranchers are running cows on private lands, the average cost of a grazing lease is $22 an animal unit month. So basically, the ranchers are getting a huge subsidy. And that doesn't even count things like drought payments and other kinds of farm bill payments that these same ranchers are collecting. It's pretty fragile and pretty marginal for plants out here. It's alkaline soils, pretty dry. And so the plants are kind of hanging on by their fingernails. This would be a greasewood flat normally with saltbush, but most of the shrubs have been trampled to death by the cattle. During the winter period, there's nothing growing out here, and it's pretty tough for cattle to find enough to live on. And certainly if you've got the cattle that are hitting the winter range, then it's pretty tough for the wildlife to find anything to eat as well. So it's kind of an ugly situation. Cattle and sheep are fundamentally different ecologically than wild horses. Cattle especially are different. Cattle will concentrate in riparian areas at the most fertile, productive areas of the land, and they will stay there 100% of the time, concentrating their impacts at the most fragile, biodiverse, and important part of the desert ecosystem. Wild horses range over very large areas, so they spread their impacts out. It's a lot more like bison graze. So ecologically, wild horses are a lot better of a fit for arid western landscapes than livestock are for this reason. The livestock industry likes to blame wild horses for damaging the range and ecological land health problems that are out there on public lands that often do exist. The problem is that wild horses are so radically outnumbered by livestock that it's kind of laughable to finger wild horses as the cause of the problem. If you look at just the public lands and you correct for the fact that wild horses are out there for 12 months of the year, whereas cattle sometimes are out there for only part of the year, about 30% of the time they're out there all year. But the BLM counts the animal unit months, which is the measure that's one cow-calf pair for 1 month. And that equals one horse for 1 month. And if you look at it apples to apples, AUMs to AUMs, what you find is there are 14.8 AUMs of cattle in the wild horse states on public lands for every AUM of wild horses. So wild horses are outnumbered by cattle strictly on public lands based on their grazing intensity, 15-1. And if you think about wildlife in the West don't respect public land, private property boundaries. They wander everywhere. So if you're looking at the ecological impact of wild horses and cattle, maybe you ought to be looking at all the lands, because all the lands are potentially wildlife habitat. At that point, you have at most, and this is probably an overestimate, but at most 100,000 wild horses in the West. And you have 18.5 million cattle in those same states. So you have 185 cows for every wild horse in the American West, impacting wildlife. Are wild horses really a major problem for wildlife when you've got a non-native species called cattle that is leveling 185 times the ecological footprint? It seems unlikely, and that doesn't even consider domestic sheep, which are out there by the millions.
In addition to the inequities, the Bureau of Land Management has never attempted to understand the place of the wild horse in the West. In this next piece, we will take you to the Mojave Desert, where groundbreaking research has shown how wild burros, a cousin to wild horses that are also protected under the Act, are affecting the availability of water in their desert ecosystems.
I first became interested in studying the wild burrows while working out here on a different project with the USGS, looking at plants and birds, and seeing these wild donkeys everywhere. And what I found particularly interesting about them is that this place once had many animals, much like wild burrows, big, large, plant-eating herbivores that went extinct not too long ago, like 12,000 years ago on this continent, from human hunting. And so the return of these burrows brings all sorts of questions about how ecosystems work and whether these animals are restoring lost capacities to influence the environment. I'm particularly interested in how they affect the availability of water in the desert. So I've been remarkably lucky to find these incredible oases in the desert where groundwater seeps to the surface. And these are the biodiversity hotspots of these desert ecosystems, full of birds and plants. And in some cases, these are the only water sources within dozens of kilometers in the desert. But many of these systems become extremely monotypic, one plant species dominating. And without flood disturbance or animal disturbance, these systems can become extremely inaccessible to other animals and even lose their surface water from all the plants sucking that water into the air. But there are some of these sites that I've found where burros make these open glades by browsing and grazing vegetation. Because they are so large, they can stomp and dig and graze out wetlands and maintain access to surface water up to 1.5 meters in depth. And more plant species and animal species. This is something that we'd only see if we dropped the label of invasive from wild burros and horses. I've put trail cameras on these water points, and those let me quantify both the activity patterns of burros and mountain lions, and also what other species are using these wetlands and these wells that they're digging. As many as, I think it's about 65 species are drinking from these water points, which is just incredible. And this has never been described in the scientific literature. Probably because it doesn't fit the narrative that we've framed these animals with, which is ultimately not a scientific narrative, but a value-based one. So this is this really unique environment that's created by this megafaunal disturbance. In some river systems, this kind of pool would be created by flooding, which would scour out vegetation. But this site, many sites like it in the desert, don't receive floods. They're groundwater fed and they're in these low disturbance systems. So I'm really curious as to what animals are using this compared to these undisturbed sites. And as Death Valley National Park removes the burrows here, I'm interested in how these places change and how the animals and plants that are using them change. You can see the real difference here with the disturbance by the wild burrows. There's less vegetation, there's open channel, there's clear, deep surface water. And then without the burrows, where there's no flood disturbance and no megafauna disturbance, water is about a centimeter or two deep. It's often very, very muddy and extremely dense, which is presenting a habitat that some species are going to prefer, and this is presenting a habitat that other species will prefer. And these are the types of questions that bring us back to millions of years of Earth history where large animals were disturbing environments like this. We tend to think of disturbance as being not part of the world, but it's actually part of Earth's history for millions of years. And this trampling, this grazing by introduced donkeys is actually making this place more similar to how it was before humans arrived some 12,000 years ago. So one key question in how wild donkeys and wild horses affect ecosystems is the context in which they live. And one of the big contexts that influences herbivores are predators, particularly large-bodied apex predators like wolves or mountain lions in the case of these deserts here in the Southwest. Apex predation is an ecological context that is rarely taken into account when we've studied wild equids. And it's certainly not taken into account when we talk about the horse and burro problem. My preliminary research is finding that mountain lions really do strongly influence wild burros through predation and through causing what we call in ecology a landscape of fear. And the landscape of fear idea is that the risk of being attacked by a predator varies according to topography and environment, ambush cover, etc. And so you get a landscape where there's peaks of high fear and then valleys where fear is low. And so you see animal activities corresponding to those peaks and valleys. In the Mojave Desert, one of the sites I work at is this amazing jungle spring. And in this spring, there are these little glades that the burros have carved out in the vegetation. And almost every single one of those, just a little ways off, there's a little tiny trail through the jungle that the mountain lions have made. And then there'll be piles of dead burros. So here we are, this is off of a burro trail. This burro and this one, and there's a couple others over here. We're all dragged here by a mountain lion and eaten in this thicket, this jungle. If you spend any time walking around here, you'll find tons of burros that have been killed by mountain lions. Some of my preliminary results are showing that there are areas with lots of mountain lions where wild burros are very tentative and reluctant to go, which prevents burros from completely using the spring in its entirety and forces them to use these narrow pockets where they create these open freshwater glades. It's really pretty astounding, especially given that nobody thinks that burros have predators. And that's part of the myth that hopefully my work will help dispel and help us understand what context this type of predation can happen. Wild horses and burros, as formerly domesticated animals, exist in this weird in-between space where we often don't have the right words to talk about them. One that crops up all the time in regards to introduced species, and it's a value of nativism, where certain species have a different intrinsic right to exist than other species because of our involvement in moving them somewhere. The term invasive I find problematic when applied to any species. It is extremely anthropomorphic and emotional, and it infers intent that this introduced species built ships to come here to pillage. And by giving it intent, it justifies us in all sorts of lethal, inhumane, and unethical ways of treating these sentient beings. We could ask a whole different series of questions if we just change that valuation and that narrative about them. I'm not interested in advocacy per se, but I'm fascinated by them as animals, as megafauna. Large-bodied animals are some of the most endangered in the world, and they've been part of the Earth system since the beginning. For 30 to 40 million years, every continent on Earth was teemed with a diversity of big animals. And so I'm fascinated by how these introduced animals are functioning in modern ecosystems. One way to look at this is to think about what would happen if burrows were removed. In the 90s, they removed all the burrows from Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge in Nevada, a beautiful place full of groundwater springs. And many of these springs filled in with vegetation, and some of them actually dried up completely. And a number of endemic fish populations, which are these really endangered organisms in the desert, actually went extinct from this. So these animals play a really important role in maintaining these resource points. Now, I'd avoid calling these processes good or bad. If we call them good, we end up living in the same kind of binary judgment system that leads us to calling them invasive. As scientists, we can focus on data and leave the value judgments for the people that are making the decisions.
This is a solvable issue, and solutions exist right now to help keep wild horses wild and alleviate competition on public lands. We're proving it right now in the greater Reno area, thanks to the help of local Nevadans who care about their wild horses and want to help create change.
She has long been at the forefront at the nationwide effort to save the wild horses and the burros of America. I present to you Mrs. Velma B Johnson, commonly known as Wild Horse Annie.
I had heard about airborne roundups, but as so many of us do when something unpleasant doesn't touch our lives directly, I pretended it wasn't there and maybe it would go away. The roundups were cruel beyond belief, indiscriminate. Injuries were numerous. Sometimes these animals were chased at breakneck speed.
The horses are iconic. It's a symbol of the West. It's a symbol of freedom. I see these roundups and I see what they're doing to these beautiful animals. I've been around horses a good part of my life, but being around a wild horse is a whole different experience.
I like to think they are symbolic of the indomitable spirit of America, that we're going to survive in spite of anything.
The Virginia Range is a 300,000-acre land area in northern Nevada. It encompasses Fernley, Silver Springs, Virginia City, and Dayton, and is home to approximately 3,000 free-ranging horses that have lived here for centuries. The Virginia Range horses were the ones that inspired a woman named Velma Johnson, aka Wild Horse Annie, to lead a movement to protest the manner in which wild horses were being rounded up for commercial purposes. Her movement led to the passing of the Wild Horse Annie Act in 1959. Ironically, the federal law that is in place today to protect the West's herds, the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971, actually precludes the Virginia Range horses from that protection. So, when they need to be removed, they will go directly to auctions, which are often frequented by kill buyers, those individuals who purchase horses and ship them to Canada and Mexico for slaughter. The issue facing this particular herd of horses is quite unique. Unlike most of the wild horses who live in some of the most remote areas of the West, the Virginia Range horse's habitat falls largely on private land, and they are routinely being threatened by habitat loss due to urban development. For over 50 years, the main form of management of the West's wild horses has been helicopter stampedes and capture operations. there is a more humane and effective way to manage wild horses on the range while stabilizing their populations, using a safe and proven fertility control vaccine called PZP. We knew we had to do something to help these horses, and we needed to get creative. So, we entered into a cooperative agreement with the Nevada Department of Agriculture, the agency responsible for overseeing the horses, to humanely manage using the safe and proven fertility control vaccine PZP. This is that story.
Mismanagement by the federal and state government over the years has let the horse population grow into a problem instead of an asset. It can be an asset, and it should be an asset, but we have to manage these animals correctly to do it.
The current procedure of rounding up the horses, you got two choices. They go to slaughter or they go in long-term holding forever. And we as taxpayers pay millions of dollars to keep them in holding.
The lifetime cost of a mare taken into captivity with a roundup is between $35,000 and $50,000 a year.
Well, the government is spending other people's money and they think it's a bottomless pit. Unfortunately, I think when you get to the government side, the heart is not there. It's statistics, it's arguments, but there's not a lot of heart there. There's just talking points.
The current procedure, there's no end game. It's kicking the can down the road. We actually solve the problem.
The American Wild Horse Campaign and its volunteers are humanely managing the Virginia Range wild horses with a fertility control vaccine with over 30 years of safe and proven use called PZP. PZP prevents fertilization in wild mares and is delivered remotely with a dart that is fired through an air rifle.
The BLM fails at using PZP because they have never established a program that really uses it. So they don't have the manpower, they've never allocated the funds, and so consequently, they go to what's familiar, and they've done it since 1971 when we passed the act, and that is they go to the helicopter roundup, they gather them up, they take them in holding, they try to adopt them. If that doesn't work, they put them in long-term holding, and the bill just keeps going up.
PZP is actually a way to manage the horses and to keep the population down so that they can remain wild and on the range, which is where they should be. Each dose is about $35. So for the first year, we should dart 3 times. After that, it becomes less.
The BLM's actually digging a deeper hole because the more horses that they gather, the more the horses react and actually breed more and have more babies. That's referred to as compensatory reproduction. This is in the National Academy of Science documentation that came out in 2013. But when you think about it, every foal that isn't born is $50,000 that you save because it doesn't go into the adoption program and into long-term holding, and that's money saved versus money spent.
One day, as I was driving into Reno, I came upon a truckload of mutilated horses, and I followed that truck. I saw for myself the brutality of the treatment. And I knew I could not live with myself if I didn't try to do something about it.
When I was growing up on the farm in Connecticut, I was an avid hunter. I hunted every chance I could get. I was deer hunting, and I shot a deer, and it wasn't a clean shot, and I had to go and put her out of her misery. She looked at me and cried. They cry, and it broke my heart. That ended it for me. Good shot.
One down.
Currently, we're in the process of administering PZP to just under 3,000 horses total, which is the largest PZP operation in the world.
So the dart gun does look like a rifle. It is CO2 powered, means it works on air. When I'm going out to dart and I pull up and see a herd of horses, immediately I'm getting my tablet out to pull up my darting reports and database so I can see who am I going to be able to dart today. My spotter will hand me the PZP, we mix it up, and then we inject that into a dart. That dart is dropped into my rifle, then we're ready to go. When that dart hits the horse, it ejects the vaccine into the horse, pops out.
We always shoot in the rump. We're very, very careful about hitting that area. We don't want to hit the horse in any other area.
Some horses, they'll run a few feet and stop. Some horses will buck. The other ones will just kind of look and go, what was that? Our spotter's job is to watch where that dart pops out, and we pick it up. We do not leave it on the range.
We try not to pressure the horses. We try to be very horse-friendly. It requires a lot of patience sometimes. We actually run a darting report, and we do it the night of. So if somebody goes out the next day, it's current information. And so you enter it into a database, and then it shows on the darting report that horse has been darted, distance, which hip, by who.
There's also safety to the surrounding areas. You can't dart too close to any highway. You cannot dart close to homes. We have an app that was recommended from American Wild Horse Campaign that will let me know if I'm on land where I can dart or not.
Tracking of the horses, actually documenting them, is a huge job. You have to photograph the horse from 3 views, head on, either side. The horse gets a name, it gets a number, and that's how we keep track of the horse. It's a pretty cool system. The amazing value of PZP is that it does not change the behavior of the mare. If the mare is carrying a foal, it does not interfere with the growth of the foal, doesn't affect in any way the mare's milk. It doesn't migrate into the environment, and it's reversible. It does not change the reproductive system of the mare, so it does not sterilize. That's a myth. It's really a pretty amazing substance.
The Virginia Range can be a great proving ground for programs, especially to the BLM. Because it's contained geographically. We know how many horses are on it. So why not use this as a study ground? Let's use it as an example. And then we can go to the BLM and say, guys, we know how to fix this problem. It's going to take 5 years, 10 years, but this is how we can fix it without causing these animals harm, without causing the environment harm, and by the same time, letting these animals roam free.
This dedicated group of volunteers under the American Wild Horse Campaign in 2 years have darted more wild mares with humane fertility control than the entire Bureau of Land Management has done over the last 4 years. Wild horses absolutely can be managed humanely in the wild, and we've proven it.
There's some corporations that have gotten behind this, but you couldn't do it without the local groups. These guys are my heroes.
We'll be out there all day in 95-degree heat working our rear ends off. But the joy you get in knowing you're saving the horses, you're keeping them on the range, being amongst them, you get such a reward in your heart. The American Wild Horse Campaign does a great job of supplying us with the materials, the training, any help we need, they're there for us. It's a great team to work for.
It's a thankless task. There's nothing easy about it.
I mean, they're out there in the winter, in the snow, in the summer, in the heat, and they're out there doing the job simply for their love of the animals, love of the environment itself, and the way the animals interact with that.
I'm just going to tell you, thank God we have them. Otherwise, it would be a much different world around us.
Working with American Wild Horse Campaign is very emotional to me, and I just feel very lucky and special to be able to do it.
Doing this work has given me an outlet to feel like I'm doing something in a very productive way that makes a difference.
I've been rewarded 10 times over with the experience and the challenge and the beauty of these animals and being amongst them.
I still have that challenge of tracking something down, but now I'm helping them instead of hurting them. I'm living my dream now.
We built the West on these horses.
They helped us to become Americans in many ways. So when you add all that up, they've earned their place in the West.
They don't judge. They don't fear you until you make them fear you. They just want to be free. They want to live the way they've always lived. And that should be everybody's right.
You know, that's the great thing about living in America. If you believe in something, you can fight for it.
All right, so first up we have Greg Hendricks. Greg Hendricks is the Director of Field Operations for the American Wild Horse Campaign. He received his BS degree in Range Management and Wildlife Biology from Washington State University. Early within his career, he worked for Carson City BLM, managing their range improvement budget. As an avid wild horse advocate, he has worked to support the prison adoption program in Carson City, from which he has adopted 2 wonderful Mustangs. He also represents wild horses and burros for the Bureau of Land Management Sierra Front Northwest Great Basin Resource Advisory Council. Next up is Eric Mulvar, who is the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project, beginning his career in conservation, fighting oil and gas projects in Wyoming during the Bush administration, with his signature accomplishment defeating the Seminole Road coal bed methane project during that time. He's a wildlife biologist with published research in the behavior, ecology, and population dynamics of Alaskan moose, as well as large-scale conservation planning. He spent 13 years as a conservation advocate and later executive director of Biodiversity Conservation Alliance and led Wild Earth Guardian's Sagebrush Sea campaign for 3 years. Over this period, he became one of the conservation community's leader in sage grouse conservation and recovery. All right, next up is Scott Wilson, a landscape photographer of 20 years. Scott Wilson was a multi-year finalist in the UK Landscape Photographer of the Year before moving to Colorado in 2015. He was introduced to the beauty and the plight of America's Mustangs. Scott closely follows the wild ones that roam San Wash Basin in northwest Colorado and has become a committed photo advocate for wild horse conservation, joining the board of the American Wild Horse Campaign in 2021. Scott was recently named Open Photographer of the Year in 2022 Sony World Photography Awards and also brought home the Natural World and Wildlife Award for Anger Management, which is a photo that depicts a wild Colorado Mustang kicking up a dust storm. Scott's work is on show at Gallery 6 in Denver's downtown art district and has been featured extensively in local, national, and international media, including the BBC, Daily Telegraph, Nat Geo, GQ, and more. Erik Lundgren is a postdoctoral researcher at Aarhus University in Denmark and received his PhD at the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. His work primarily focuses on novel ecosystems or communities composed of both introduced and native species. Most of his research focuses on large herbivores, in particular equids, in which he has shown remarkable ecological processes hidden by notions of naturalness. And then finally, we have Chris Thompson, who is a leader in the Reno area business community. He is the project manager of the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, which encompasses a third of the Virginia range horse habitat here in Reno, and is president of the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center General Improvement District. Chris is a member of the Story County Planning Commission and is a retired Army colonel who commanded combat troops in Desert Storm and other conflicts. Okay, so those are our panelists. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so the first question is for Greg. As someone who has worked for the BLM in range management, including with wild horses, what do you think the biggest barriers are to changing the current system?
Thanks, Grace. A little bit more background on it. I worked for the Carson City District from 78 through 7 years worth as a range conservation with them. And during that period, I worked with wild horses and range improvement and with their rack. And with that, one of the barriers that we're running into is the real need to change. And BLM, I have a lot of friends that still at BLM, and I like them, and a lot of them really work hard to try and do the right thing. But when it comes to the Wild Horse and Burro program, they've lived and they've managed with helicopter roundups since the very start. And when we first started, we'd gather 4,000 horses and we'd adopt 4,000 horses. And I worked out at the Palomino Valley Corrals, and the line of trucks and trailers to pick up the horses was pretty significant. Now those lines are gone. And so is the price of hay, $25 a bale for some of it. So the real barricade is change, and it's change moving from roundups to moving to fertility control. And they're starting to get it. I mean, if you look on their website, they're starting to talk more about fertility control, but they're doing it in conjunction with roundups. And that's expensive. It costs a lot of money to run a horse into a corral at a high rate of speed, and it's not too good for the horse either. So the bottom line is change, and the change comes with opening your mind and your budget and your planning, so you plan for field darting to back up what you're doing with your roundups. Sure, they're doing fertility control now when they round them up, but it's one and done, and they're back again in 4 years with more horses than they started with. So fertility control darting, getting your programs going, and making certain that you expand so you're not one and done, and you're continuing your fertility control to the next year and the next year, so you don't have that big spike of population. That's really important, and that's one of our biggest barriers that we're running into right now.
All right. This question is for Eric Mulvar. What do you think of the characterization of wild horses as the existential threat to Western public lands?
Well, I've been a conservation professional in the West for 22 years now, and I've faced a lot of the existential threats to public lands. And the first thing that I'd like to point out, and that's a quote from William Perry Penley, the former BLM director under the Trump administration. He claimed that wild horses were an existential threat. And an existential threat is a threat that makes something cease to exist. So what makes the public land cease to exist is the land seizure agenda of some people in politics who want to privatize the public land. And William Perry Penley was a leading actor who wanted to do that. That's the existential threat. Okay? Now, when you're talking about the environmental threats to the public lands, there's a lot of them. I fought oil and gas development for many years, and that's a spectacular destruction of public lands in those areas that have a lot of oil and gas resources. There are power lines that traverse the public lands. And if you're a sage grouse and power lines are coming across the landscape, each one of those power line towers can be a roosting platform for hawks and eagles and ravens, which are your nest predators. And so basically the areas within 2 to 5 miles of these power lines will get depopulated of sage grouse. That's a massive impact on sage grouse. You've got livestock, which are basically ubiquitous throughout the basins of the American West. And the livestock are authorized to clean off more than half of the annual forage production for the entire year. Now, if you think about that, if you've got the livestock taking 50% and you've got all those other species taking their cut, what's left for the actual perennial bunch grasses to survive? Not much. So basically, functionally, what we're doing with our livestock program is we are destroying the landscape on purpose in order to produce cattle and sheep on public lands. That's a massive threat. And then you get way down the list. I actually listed it out once, and I think I got down to number 17 before wild horses even entered the conversation. So wild horses are functionally trivial from an ecological standpoint. And that's the reality. That's the ecological reality. Now, that might not be the political reality. That's a different story.
Okay, Scott Wilson. You all haven't heard Scott speak, probably many of you, but he is not from here. So coming from Europe, what surprised you about how wild Mustangs are viewed and treated in the United States?
Thank you. You now have to guess which part of Europe I'm from, but in terms of, and it's not Ireland, In terms of surprises, I mean, I think, you know, I grew up like many children in Europe with this kind of folklore image of wild horses and the romance in the sort of American plains. And then you come here and genuinely you're quite shocked, I think, by the treatment, the behavior, and I think generally speaking, a lot of the ignorance as well. I mean, I started photographing wild horses in Colorado 5 years ago, and the amount of people in Denver, which is obviously the biggest city, that had no idea there were even horses in Colorado. So I think just building this sense of awareness, so the sort of low awareness, I think, is something that really struck me. Public lands as a concept was also a surprise to me. I mean, we have state parks, national parks in the UK, but they tend to be privately owned. And to me, I think the notion that you have public lands is something absolutely amazing about the United States. This notion that you kind of said, hold on, we've got lands out here, we need to preserve them or protect them, and there's animals in there that we want to preserve and protect. And then to my mind, as you know, coming in, something's gone wrong. And you know, and just this notion that you've got this amazing legacy of public lands that were set aside for protection, but they've been kind of intruded by commercial interests. So I think that's been a big surprise, that you had something so right and we're allowing it to go so wrong. So I think I would probably leave it there. So.
Okay, this one is for Eric Lundgren. What is your research uncovering regarding the role of predators in maintaining ecological balance and regulating wild horse and burro populations?
Hello, everybody. Don't let me speak too jargony. I've been writing a bunch of science, so my brain is a little bit out of our normal realm, but just call me out. You know, so it's a really interesting thing is that when you look at the literature and at the government documents about horses and burros, there is this claim everywhere that they have no natural predators. It's just ubiquitous. And yet you go out into these areas and there is tons of predation happening, especially in areas where we actually, you know, don't kill all of these predators. And I've found some really remarkable patterns, and the video talked about it a little bit in the context of what some people call a landscape of fear, in that the fear of predation transforms the behavior of these animals. And I haven't studied wild horses, but this is with burros. I've been starting to study wild horses, but it's really hard to find a place that isn't mostly cattle. But with burros, you know, when there's no mountain lions, if you're at wetlands that are by a campsite or are really flat, places that mountain lions don't like to hunt, the donkeys are there, they're showing up at the water at night, and they're staying 12 hours a day when it's hot. And they're trampling that place to the ground. And then you go a little bit further away from campsites or into areas with a little bit more ambush cover, and the donkeys are there for 40 minutes a day at the same temperatures. And they have a vastly different effect. And when you look at the literature, surprisingly, this context is just not taken into account in science or in policy or in discussion, that the way these animals affect the environment is really contingent upon that situation. And I'd just like to, you know, make note in here that we kill mountain lions and wolves at dramatic levels. And this is by hunters and trappers, but also by the federal government and state government. It's very hard to find a place where these animals aren't killed. And there is a strange correspondence in the areas that mountain lions are really aggressively targeted for removal and burro and horse populations that are increasing dramatically. So hopefully this is something that people can start to pay more attention to.
Okay, this one is for Chris. So you have been a great advocate of Mustangs. Can you tell us what role they've played in your successful effort to attract businesses to the area?
Thank you. First, let me say this. I'm going to talk about how good it is for branding and bringing companies in here, as I think we've shown here recently. But let's not forget, it's the right thing to do. And every time I see the volunteers darting out there, it is humbling, truly humbling, because that's where the work takes place. So, but in terms of branding, you know, we're in a new world, a transitory period here for the last 5 years about what companies care about, what attracts them, and wild horses are part of the TRI in particular brand. Lance Gilman has used wild horses as part of our branding. And just to prove it, if right now you took your cell phone and you typed in on your browser, Tesla, located where cowboys gamble and wild horses still roam, that is the phrase that went viral after the Tesla announcement was made. That went globally across all of the financial services. You can't get a better brand than it. Why is that attractive to people like Elon Musk of Tesla, Rob Roy of Switch, Jeff Burns of blockchains, and all the other Wall Street companies we have in? Because wild horses, they are independent, they are self-reliant, and they are rugged. They are outliers, and that's what these corporate leaders want to be seen as. Another example of how good it is in branding is Elon Musk came up after the Gigafactory was built. I think it's like 2017 in August. And he came in for one of his first visits, and I think he had a little campfire or something up on top of the building or something kind of weird that he was up to. But as he was leaving the Gigafactory, he took a little video clip of wild horses grazing up on the ridge side off of Electric Avenue. He posted it on his Instagram. And I checked it within 60 days of that post. He had 750,000 clicks, views of that. And if you looked at all the comments, there were like hundreds of comments from people all around the world about how cool that was and how great it is that Tesla's locating next to the wild horses. That's what people think. I mean, we are lucky to have those wild horses in our environment. And just the last thing I'll point out is we had a group of VIPs from the Republic of Korea, government and corporate bigwigs, that came in just last week. And I was giving them a tour and took them by the Gigafactory, okay. Took them by our $100 million reclaimed water system, okay. Took them by Switch, Google, took them by the brand new biofuels plant doing one-of-a-kind recycling. Well, I was okay. On the way out, we saw wild horses. The van had to stop. They had to get out. All of them wanted pictures of the wild horses. They help. So thank you.
That's what you call a mic drop. Mic drop. Okay. All right. So this is a question submitted from the audience. It's geared-ish towards you, Greg. If PZP and your darting program is so effective, why are there so many foals this year? Foals. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you there's a lot fewer foals this year than there was in 2020. And I can tell you that we're 68% fewer foals this year in our preliminary data. And that's over 250 fewer foals per year. So you still see foals, that's going to happen, but there's a lot fewer. And what we're doing is we're turning the corner to try and bring the populations down, so we don't have the spikes that occur when you have roundups where the horses have more opportunity to breed in larger numbers and have more feed, et cetera. So bringing the numbers down is really a critical element for the Virginia range.
Okay, next question is open-ended. This is also from the audience. How many horses or burros are the maximum number that the Nevada range can support after taking into account all of the other mammals on the range? I'm gonna gear this way.
I'd like to start this one because the question really is, what's the carrying capacity of the range for wild horses? And I think to start thinking about this question, you have to go back to the baseline. And there's a study by Beaver and Aldridge from 2011, the sage grouse monograph, that was looking at the impacts of wild horses on sage grouse. And they estimated that there were 2 to 7 million wild horses in North America in the late 1700s or early 1800s. So that's the time of Lewis and Clark. At this same time, there were 55 million bison. There were 10 million elk. There are only 1 million today. There are 380,000 wolves. There were 16 million sage grouse. This is the thriving natural ecological balance that should be the baseline we're shooting for, okay? Now, I'm not going to say that there could be 2 million wild horses in North America today because a lot of the land has been converted to hayfields, to towns, to highways. But Today, we have somewhere in the neighborhood, the BLM estimates nationwide, 82,000, and half of which roughly are in Nevada. That's a tiny, tiny, tiny little fragment of what was here before Euro-American colonization of the West. So fundamentally, what you have to ask yourself is, if the wild horses are such a tiny fraction of what they used to be, but also the bison are a tiny fraction of what they used to be, and the wolves are a tiny fraction of what they used to be, and the sage grouse are down to about 200,000, tiny, tiny fraction. What happened? What is really impacting the wildlife? And the answer is, we've got 100 million cows in North America now. And that's the difference. So if you took that heavy grazing pressure off the land, which I think from a biological standpoint you'd have to do to be intellectually honest about it, and said, how many wild horses could you have? The answer is considerably more than we have today, and you wouldn't be overpopulated.
Okay, so Scott, as I said in your intro, you just won the 2022 Sony World Photography Awards. What do you hope to accomplish through the international recognition of the wild horse image?
Thanks, Grace. I think for me, way beyond the kind of personal recognition was awareness. And we talked about people in Colorado not even knowing there's wild horses in Colorado. So you multiply that by the world, and there was something like 170,000 entries into this competition from 200 countries, and then the platform winning that has given me to then talk to the media. So I've been on the BBC, I've been in Fox News here, CBS, etc., and just putting it out there that A, wild horses exist, and then B, opening up a conversation, a little bit like we're having here, but being able to do that on an international stage and platform. So I think that's really is the goal, is to just introduce this subject to millions across the world. And you know, this sort of notion of see yourself as others see you, when you start to introduce the subject internationally, people are shocked. Just really, you know, just this constant threat, a roundup, the numbers, some of the statistics that Eric is sharing, when you start to put that out there, people are baffled by the treatment. So the awareness is starting to work. And then there was a sort of personal agenda as well for me, I think, to introduce more people outside of the US to the wildness, just the wild behaviors. And these are very different animals to domestic horses. And to actually be able to photograph them in the wild is an absolute privilege. To be able to then share that as a piece of art with people and allow them to appreciate the difference a wild horse is to a domestic horse from an aesthetic point of view and a behavioral point of view is absolutely fantastic. And then in the US, I have found barriers sometimes introducing wild horses into wildlife competitions. You know, it's like you get they're feral, it's not quite the same as a wild animal. You introduce a wild horse in international competition and all those prejudices fall away. There's just this recognition that wild is wild. And I think that was a really important message that I wanted to bring back home from that international competition.
Okay, so we have about 5 more minutes, so we can allow, mingling before Patagonia closes their doors. And you can, of course, talk to our panelists independently. All right, so Eric Lundgren, what does your research show about the role of large grazers in ecosystems, and why do you think more research hasn't been done on the subject?
Well, research has been done on the subject, but it's always in native systems. And most of those are in Africa, mostly Africa. And we've found amazing things. And these things are often kind of challenge our notions of how ecosystems work. One of the fascinating things that I've found doing this recent work is that the effects of wild horses, as documented, are exactly the same as the effects of large animals in native systems. There's no difference, even with claims of overpopulation. Large herbivores have really strong effects, and these effects are multidirectional. They can suppress some plant species and groups and reduce their diversity, and they can also increase plant species diversity. They can outcompete smaller bodied animals, but they can also facilitate them, for instance, by digging wells to water and increasing water availability. So it's like anything in ecology, it's complex. And yet there is this little niche in ecology and conservation biology where we've moralized it and not let it be ecology anymore. And that's wild horses and burros and other introduced species really are the victim of that, where anything they do is bad. And it's like it defies the way ecology actually works, which is that you have a predator that reduces the abundance of its prey, which increases the abundance of its prey, and leads to these complex emergent properties of ecosystems. With invasion biology and with wild horses, you show that they reduce the abundance of one thing, and then you close the book and you say you've shown your case, and it's not ecology anymore. Fortunately, there are a lot of people that are renewing interest and research on introduced large herbivores in the context of Earth's history and in the context of what big animals do to ecosystems, and finding really amazing things.
Okay, Chris Thompson. From your perspective, what solutions have you seen for balancing development and wildlife protection?
Thank you. Well, first, I have to say that the program put in place by American Wild Horse Campaign, I can testify has worked. The darting works. I know this because for 10 years as the project manager, I've lived in TRI. Nobody spends more days in TRI than me. I see those horses every day. I see the foals. You can see the ribs during the bad times, like when the cooperative agreement was undone. The horses, you could see some of the horses starving. The program works. That's number one. Number two, we are living proof that you can have balance between nature, between ranching, and between industry. We have about 85% of our land mass is still, of our original land mass, is still kind of open range territory, which has no buildings on it, it's ridges and valleys. But we brought in bighorn sheep that now are about 300 or 400 roaming the Virginia range. I just had pictures this morning I posted on my Facebook, and they're big and chunky. And we have a rancher that brings in 200 head of Black Angus every spring or every November to winter the cattle in parts of the original landmass of TRI. He's been doing this for 10 years. Obviously, there's enough grass for him, and the horses are doing fine. Our companies have put up water stations for the horses so that they don't wander into the built-up area. But the American wild horse has proven that it's possible to have balance in nature without roundups, without removals, without killing, without shipping to Mexico. It is possible, and it is working today. And for that, thank you to the American Wild Horse Campaign.
Okay, so we are at 8:45. So I had a couple more questions from the audience, but I think if it's okay with everybody that we would individual conversations so we can let the folks of Patagonia. Okay, so we'll start with one. All right, great. So why do you use PZP for birth control instead of Gonacon? Sure, yeah.
There's a number of really good reasons for using PZP, and one of them is that it's well established. It's been researched for 35 years, started out at Assateague Island, and it is very, very well researched on how well it works, 96% efficacy if you do it right. And it also is an amino contraceptive. So what it does is it affects the reproductive system via a response from the immune system. And it coats the egg with that response and keeps it from being able to be fertilized. That also allows the mare to maintain her hormones and her behaviors. And so you have wild horses, again, still being wild horses, but not pregnant wild horses. So the bottom line with PZP is the fact that it also gives the opportunity, if you want to release a mare to have a baby, that can happen. And you can do that by just not treating her that year. And that gives an opportunity to bring genetics back in if need be, and also for younger mares to be able to contribute to the actual herd. So it's an extremely positive immunocontraceptive. Gonacon affects the hormones. It blocks them, literally. And it is not easily injected via remote dart. It's very thick. It can create abscesses and has created a lot of abscesses. And it's not researched well. It has research. The Theodore Roosevelt Park researched it, but they stopped it early. And so what's happened is you don't have that long-term knowledge that you have with PZP as to can it be reversed, how much time in between doses, and are you going to sterilize the mare after 2 doses? They say 4. It depends. Nobody really knows right now. So there's a lot still to be done. And again, the thing about it that's probably the most difficult is it has to be hand injected really to be utilized. So it's a roundup drug. And again, not very well understood as far as its efficacy and its impact. And it definitely has a very negative impact to the actual animal's ability to be able to recover from it because of the abscesses and the large granulomas that it develops.
Okay, we're going to do one more question to satisfy the gentleman in the audience. So why aren't you going after cattle and mining industries? And I'm going to field this to you because you have been involved in litigation with us. So.
Well, that's an ironic one to give to me because we are going after the cattle and the mining industries. I mean, I think, we're, okay, yeah, that's not really a question for me.
Short answer is we are. You can find it at AmericanWildHorseCampaign.org under litigation. You will see that we have. But honestly, the biggest threat to wild horse and burro populations is the livestock industry, and we are constantly involved in litigation. Gearing up for one right now. Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And feel free. We have information. You can talk to our panelists. Have a great night.